Hello, this is Talking Europe on France 24. Today we are speaking to the President of Estonia, Alar Karis. Welcome to the programme.
Hello.
I'd like to just tell my viewers a bit more about your country and things going on there currently. Estonia, the northernmost of the three Baltic EU member states. Its population of around 1.3 million people sharing land borders with Russia and fellow EU member Latvia. Now, Estonia has just marked 30 years since its independence was restored following almost half a century of Soviet rule, and it's currently centre stage of international diplomacy, holding one of the temporary seats at the United Nations Security Council this year. My guest, Alar Karis, has been president of his country for just over 1 month. A biologist and former university professor turned university rector, museum director and auditor general. You were nominated by both the current coalition parties, elected unopposed at the end of August. So Alar Karis, I'd like to start off just by talking about that, your career in science and academia mostly. How does that experience translate to being president of a EU member state, a NATO member state?
So we'll see, because I've been a president only for 1 month, but I think these kind of experiences quite good. So I've been a scientist, but I also been an auditor general. That means I know also internal affairs quite well, because in Estonia you are taking part of government sittings, so you get the background of everything what's going on, also foreign affairs.
There have been other European states where leading politicians have said things like, we've had enough of experts in recent years. Is this an indication that Estonia sees things differently?
It's difficult to say, because you can also hear this kind of reactions that we have enough experts. Politicians say we got a wider view and so forth. But I'm not an expert in that sense. So I'm now a president, and you have to be an expert on everything, basically. So, but you got a good advisors, and I think this will help.
Now, your election as president was the first election of an unopposed presidential candidate since the end of the Soviet times. I mean, your own inauguration speech, you seem to touch on the idea of possible reform of the system. Do you agree then with those people who say that, you know, this was problematic on a democratic front?
I had these discussions with politicians, and also afterwards during this month I have been a president. So there is a willingness to change the system, but we'll see how it goes, because for me it's not a problem to change the system, and if there is a demand or a wish, we should proceed with that. Although there have been several attempts already in past, so we'll see how it goes.
Okay, I'd like to move on to some of the big news stories around Europe, starting in Belarus, a state very close to Estonia geographically, very much in the headlines, as we know. How dangerous do you think the situation is on Belarus's borders with neighbouring Poland, Lithuania and Latvia, this pressure from the migrants, states of emergency in those three EU states?
I think it's a threat, so we should look at it very carefully, and not only Estonia as a closest neighbor to, let's say, Latvia and Lithuania and Poland, but also EU in general, because it's a border of European Union, it's a border of NATO state. So we should be very careful and cautious what's going on. And I know that already German Chancellor Merkel has called to Moscow asking for some kind of help.
Now, the Polish Prime Minister has said that he believes Russia is behind this situation of bringing people to Belarus from countries like Iraq and Syria to push them towards EU neighbours with the aim of creating instability. He says it's all part of a plan by Moscow, and I quote him, to restore the Russian Empire. Now, that's quite the statement. Would you agree with him?
Well, it's difficult to say if it's a Russian restoring of a Russian empire, but definitely some strings are pulled from Moscow, and probably Lukashenko doesn't do it by himself. He's probably going to his wife or advising with Moscow all the time. So that's why Merkel called also Moscow rather than Lukashenko.
Well, indeed, Angela Merkel seems to be calling on Moscow and President Putin to resolve the situation. Can Vladimir Putin resolve this, do you think?
Well, I don't know, because it's difficult to predict. As far as Russia is concerned, it's always very difficult to predict. And these events have been before. I mean, also in 2015 was in Russian and Finnish border. So it has happened before, and somehow it did resolve. So we'll see.
There are those, including your country's defence minister, who said that the risk of escalation is, quote, extremely high. Do you also see a risk that this could escalate into something bigger? I think the inference is something military, something violent.
Yeah, it could happen because there are also military people on the Polish side and also some people on the Belarusian side. And of course, the problem is, and the sad thing is, that there are innocent people in between. So, and they're using it as a shield. And anything can happen because people have guns. And some kind of provocation, and it could happen, yes.
The EU extending sanctions against the Belarusian state. How effective do you think sanctions can be in this kind of situation?
It can be effective, but in the end, probably the ordinary people will suffer. So that's the problem. So they can't last long. I mean, so they have to be effective and should solve this problem. If not, then it's time to sit down and think what to do next.
All right, let's talk about some broader defence and security matters. One of your direct responsibilities as president relates to that. And the future of NATO is a big discussion at the moment. Estonia, a NATO member, as I said. Recently, you said yourself these events on the Belarus-Poland border demonstrate that the collective security embodied by NATO is more important than ever. Can you explain why?
That's correct, because the political situation in the world is changing all the time. And at the moment, if you think about transatlantic collaboration with US and Europe, and we see that US at the moment is looking more to China, and what we think from our position that we should keep in mind that Russia is still there and threat is still there, that we need attention to our side as well.
Right, let's talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. In Estonia, the infection rate has been one of the highest in Europe in recent weeks. Beginning of November, it was about 9 times the rate of infection in France, about 3 times the EU average. The government's recently changed rules about the COVID health pass, meaning that only people who are vaccinated or have proof of recovery and antibodies can access services like sporting events, movie screenings. The negative test is no longer part of it. Is this essentially forcing people to get vaccinated?
We will see increase of people going to vaccinate. And it's not only the government, myself, has also asked people to go to vaccinate. I've been to different places in Estonia and in different counties to talking to people. So hopefully it will improve because it's very costly and hospitals are full of COVID patients and it's close to crisis at the moment, but I hope it will change in coming weeks.
As a scientist, perhaps, rather than a president, what would you say to somebody in Estonia who's choosing not to get vaccinated?
Well, I ask them to go to vaccinate, and I can give some example from past, and we have several diseases which have been disappeared because of due to vaccination. So the same applies to COVID. So but there is always, let's say, 10% people who would never go there. So you shouldn't waste your time on these people. If you get, let's say, 85% or 90% people vaccinated, then it's almost okay.
Let's talk about climate policy. A huge focus recently in the news, of course, with the COP26 conference in Glasgow. Now, Estonia, very reliant on fossil fuels for its power and has one of the highest per capita carbon emission rates in the world. Given the current high fossil fuel dependence in Estonia, how realistic is this goal of carbon neutrality by 2050? Can your country do it?
No, I guess we can do it because we are changing quite a number of things. We have planned to have offshore wind power and so forth, together with Latvia, so we are collaborating together. We are going to use and already using biomass and so forth. I think it is possible. And of course, there are social problems. We should separate and solve them separately because people who are working in mines, they need some kind of different job and so forth. So I'm quite hopeful because an expert have been told me that that's possible, especially when we're talking about wind power.
Just like to talk about one final big foreign policy area for the EU to tackle relations with China. Now, your fellow Baltic state, Lithuania, particularly butting heads with Beijing at this point, especially over its relations with Taiwan. Now, Vilnius wants EU partners to come up with a coherent policy, they say, on China. Do you agree with Lithuania? Is the EU dispersed over its China policy?
I mean, our policy has been always one China policy, and we continue with that, of course. But problem at the moment is that there are developments that some countries continue to relate to China, let's say 16+1 or 17+1. What we want to say that we should do it together, like 27+1. So it's more like our policy.
Now, Lithuania has specifically suffered some diplomatic and economic consequences from its spat with China. For example, the Chinese ambassador being recalled, or train services, freight trains from China to Vilnius being cancelled. Alar Karis, do you fear that there could be similar negative consequences for your country if you joined Lithuania firmly in their stance?
It's very difficult what the consequence could be, because our trade with China is very, very small. It's about 1-2%. So, but we don't have this kind of thing at the moment, or this kind of threat at the moment. So we have a policy, and we don't have this embassy either in Estonia, and there have been no talks about that at the moment.
Okay, Alar Karis, thank you very much for speaking to us on Talking Europe.
Thank you.
And thanks to you as well for watching the programme. Hope to see you very soon here on France 24.